Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan Little for PokerCoaching.com, here today with a pretty interesting hand from the $10,000 buy-in GG Millions that takes place every week on GGPoker. This tournament always attracts some of the absolute biggest names in the game, and well, this week is no different. There were 3 players at the final table this week who final tabled last week. We have Vieira, one of my absolute favorite poker players. If you can ever watch him play, make sure you do it. He has a ton of earnings in live poker and online poker. And this week, in this tournament, he added another $116,000 for 6th place. Also, Yuri from the video that I made last week on my YouTube channel. He won last week. This time, he will not repeat. He took 9th. And we also have from last week, Aliaksei Boika, who I don't really know much about, but here are some stats on him. He has a whopping $3 million in tournament winnings on GGPoker. Also, $2 million live. He gets in there, he battles hard with the best players in the world, and now he is playing heads up for the title against one of the absolute masters of poker, Adrián Mateos. He is currently number 14 in the world in live tournaments. Also, he has $8 million in earnings on GGPoker, so $21 million live, $8 million on GG. He is an absolute crusher. I remember a long time ago, must have been when Adrian was like 18 years old because he's only 26 now. We were playing in Prague. At the end of the tournament series in Prague and a few of the other places, they would always have 2 turbo tournaments on the last day, usually a 5K and a 2K. And I remember Adrian was on my right, and I didn't know him. He was a young kid. To be fair, we were all young kids back then. And he did not play a hand for like an hour and a half in this turbo tournament. And then after a while, he finally raised. I picked up pocket queens and re-raised. He went all in for like 30 big blinds. I called. He had pocket aces. I got a queen, and he was out. That's good for me. And then later in the $2,000 tournament, I busted him somehow too. I don't remember how that one went down, but I remember thinking, man, that was unlucky for him. Well, lucky for him now, he won all the money, and, well, I have nowhere near $28 million in tournament earnings, so congrats to Adrian, you are the winner. All right, here we have a hand where we are playing with basically no time banks on GG at the final table. They usually give you a pretty long time bank, but both these players have used theirs up. Notice Boika is playing about 35-ish big blinds deep. First place in this tournament is $428,000. Second is $330,000. So they're essentially playing about $100,000 difference right here. They're playing for $100,000. Let's get to this hand and see how this goes down. Here we have Adrian with the Queen Jack. Pretty easy raise. And now Boika with the 7-6 should usually just call, I think. I suppose he could 3-bet it every once in a while. Typically, in this spot when I'm 3-betting, it's usually going to be with hands like King 5 offsuit, Queen 4 offsuit, Jack 5 offsuit, stuff like that. I think 7-6 just plays really well as a call. Whenever you are 3-betting with bluffs here, you typically want to have hands that block your opponent's continuing range, and that's going to be King High, Queen High, or Jack High. You could do it with some bad aces as well if you felt like it, like Ace 4. I mean, sure, you know. That said, I don't think you really want to do it with 7 high because this does not block any of your opponent's continuing range at all. You essentially want to make it more difficult for them to have hands like King 10 and Queen Jack that are always going to call against a decently strong live player. I'm sorry, a line player. I'm thinking about live poker here. I just watched the Negreanu versus Helmuth match the other day, and someone would raise, and then they would 3-bet, and the other one would just fold everything. That's not the game we're playing here. We're playing 2 good, battling online players against each other. These players do not fold decent hands. This is a spot where Queen Jack has a really, really easy call. You cannot fold here. You may think, aren't you going to be dominated sometimes? Yeah, you are. Sometimes you lose. Boika flops the middle pair, and this is a reasonable spot to go for a continuation bet, mainly just because there are a lot of bad cards for 7-6 in this scenario. And if you value bet, you can still get called by some worse hands, like pocket 5s or ace 10 with a backdoor flush draw, right? These are all hands that are going to feel pretty inclined to call a small to medium bet that you beat. That said, obviously, you're never going to make a better hand fold here. And Adrian certainly does have many of those in his range, like a whole lot of jacks. Also some underpairs like pocket 8s. So I get the idea of checking. This is a very clear marginal made hand that certainly doesn't mind checking. And now Adrian has an interesting spot because he has the best hand almost every time. But At the same time, if he thinks Boika's range is very, very weak or very, very marginal, as it very easily could be when he checks here, there's a lot of value in either checking or betting small. If you bet big, you're going to make a lot of the hands that are drawing thin to dead fold, like let's say pocket threes or ace 5 or king 10. These are hands you really don't mind keeping in the pot. That said, if you know Boika's range contains a whole lot of hands like 7-6 that are going to call any bet, then you might as well just bet and start getting money in the pot before the board gets scary for the 7-6. So this is a scenario that's very player dependent right off the bat. And if you have a pretty good idea of how your opponent plays, you can just extract loads of value here or force them to stay in the pot with a bunch of hands that are very, very marginal. Adrian gives it some thought, though. Thinking. Suppose if you use 3 seconds every time the decision's on you, you will time out. Turn is a 5, giving Boika the open-ended straight draw. And I think this is another reasonable spot to check or bet small. Whenever you are in this scenario with a pair and it goes check on the flop, and there are a lot of hands in your opponent's range that you realistically beat that can call a bet, betting becomes reasonable. Now, if Boika had a hand like 6-5, I'd be a little bit less inclined to bet, because in this scenario, he's trying to get called by a hand like pocket sixes or ace 5 or ace 4 or 4-3 suited if Adrian has that, or 6-5 suited, right? These are all hands that would, conceivably play in this manner, and these hands will all call a bet. That said, it is miserably bad if you bet here and get raised, because there are loads of draws that could bluff you, but at the same time, you are in pretty bad shape against all of the better made hands, which maybe you can discount, maybe you can't, because maybe Adrian bets all of those on the flop, or maybe he checks sometimes. Turns out, a lot of the best players in the world, like absolute sicko, Adrián Mateos, remember, Adrian's a very good player. He is not a weak, tight, straightforward player. These players will mix it up and make your life miserable. So, facing this small bet on the turn with the Queen Jack, what would you do? I want you to pause the video and write in the comment section below what you would do in this scenario. Would you make a really nitty fold? Would you call? Would you raise small to about 3 million, keeping Boika's rather shallow stack of 6 million in mind? Or would you go all in? Pause the video and write what you would do in the comment section below. All right, I hope you did that exercise. Going through this active learning process is going to go a long way to helping you improve your poker skills. It turns out quizzing yourself over and over and over and getting immediate feedback is really valuable. If you want to continue learning from me and all the other coaches that I have lined up to teach you, make sure you check out pokercoaching.com/free. I have over 1,000 interactive quizzes where I ask you how you would play on every single betting round and give you real-time feedback so that you learn how to play all the common spots well. This is a spot where you want to ask, what happens if I do insert decision? So obviously we're not folding. Queen Jack's great. Yeah, we could be beat, but if we're beat, such is life. So we're not folding. The question is, what happens if I call versus if I raise? If we call, will Boika continue bluffing the river with a lot of his bluffs, essentially any hand with a 6, like king 6 offsuit, right? Maybe that's a hand that 3-bets pre-flop and then checks the flop at best turn, or king 3 offsuit, right? Will those hands bluff again on the river? If those hands will bluff again on the river, there's a lot of value in just calling to force Boika to stay in the pot with all of those rather junky hands. What if he won't bluff those? Or what if his turn betting range is a lot of kind of weakish hands like this one that will then check fold to river bet? If that's the case, if he's betting mostly hands for value/protection but will then play cautiously on the river, you should probably just go ahead and raising it money in immediately, right? That said, I don't think you want to go for a small raise pretty much ever here, because whatever Boika is betting, you gotta presume that has at least some equity. Like say he has king 6 or king 3, right? Like even king 3 has, count the outs. It has 4 outs to the 6, 3 outs for the king. That's 7 outs. It's roughly 14-ish% equity against top pair good kicker, right? And if those hands will not continue bluffing when they miss, there's just no point in letting them see the river for free. So this is another highly player-dependent spot where I think Adrian's strategy can vary widely from either calling, because if he raises, he's mostly going to action from better hands, and perhaps Boika's range is really polarized here, although I don't think that's the case. Or he should call just to keep Boika's range wide and force him to stay in the pot with everything. So let's take a look at what Mateos does. What would I do in this spot? I would typically just call, because when it goes check, check on the flop, you have to presume Boika's range is either really strong, like super nut slow plays, or hands that have almost no equity, or draws. And hands that have almost no equity are fine to keep in, like, king 2 offsuit, right? You can have your king 2. Or hands like 7-6 that, still have pretty good equity, or hands that actually beat the queen jack. So I think this is a pretty reasonable spot to call and see what develops, but we're not really trying to fold here unless the river is especially bad. Sometimes you do get especially bad rivers, by the way. Like, say river's the 8 of spades or something and your opponent bets, you just fold. Sometimes you do get a really, really nasty river. River is the queen of spades. Should Boika turn his hand into a bluff? I don't think so. When he is against a hand like ace-5, ace-4, 6-5, maybe 6-4 suited, it's going to go check, check a lot, and 7-6 is going to win. So I don't really think you need to turn this hand into a bluff. If Boika did have a hand like king 3 or king 6, I think you need to turn those into a bluff, but not this 7-6. Once he does check, should Mateos go for value? One thing that you will consistently see from the absolute best poker players in the world is that they are not afraid to go for thin-ish value. Now, I realize top 2 pair in this scenario is not thin-ish value. This is a very obvious value bet to most people watching here, but I bet there are some people watching this today who view this as a kind of marginal spot. You may say, why? Well, because the obvious flush came in, and Boika, if he's good, and I'm presuming he is good, will sometimes check flushes. And in this spot, when Boika checks a flush and you value bet your queen jack and get called, it's pretty marginal. However, remember here that Mateos could easily have a hand like a 6. He could have a 6. He could have a hand like 4-3 suited that he decides to turn into a bluff. And certainly he has a decent number of flushes, but, not really a ton, and he doesn't really have a ton of straights here. So it turns out this is one of the better hands in his range. Also, he blocks the jack of spades, which makes it a little bit more difficult for Boika to have the flush in his hand. So I think this is a pretty reasonable spot to go for the all-in. You may say, why not go small? Because we're trying to get called by something like a jack or pocket 9s or ace-7. When you are trying to add as many bluffs to your range as possible, you usually just need to go big with the vast majority of your range. I suppose I could be convinced that Mateos could have a small betting range here with hands like jack 10, pocket 10s, etc. I think that's certainly reasonable and viable. If you've watched my Doug Polk versus Daniel Negreanu hands on my YouTube channel right here, make sure you check those out. There are a lot of spots on the river where it's very clear that the GTO type players are using some small bets and some big bets. That said, top 2 pair is usually a very, very nice hand to go for a big bet because you can get called by a lot of worse hands. And even though you may fold out a lot of marginal made hands, like let's say pocket 9s or even jack 10 facing an all-in, most good, strong, badly players realize they need to call if their opponent is adequately bluffing. And I have to presume Mateos is adequately bluffing in this spot and is willing to blast it in battle. Let's see what he does. He does elect to shove, and now this 7-6 may seem like an easy fold to some of you, but I actually think it's a little bit more difficult than it may appear. Why? Because we have the 6 of spades, which blocks a flush a little bit. It's not a ton, but a little bit. Also, we have the 6, which blocks a straight. Again, just a little bit. We're not so worried about 6-3, although 6-8 suited is certainly possible. We also have the 7 that blocks random 2 pairs, like queen 7 that would jam, or jack 7 that would jam. And that makes this hand a pretty reasonable hand to call with as a bluff catcher. The only question is Mateos bluffing anywhere near often enough? And I typically just err on the side of calling in this spot. And you may say, why in the world would you call? You lose to everything. But no, we don't lose to everything. We beat the random bluffs. Now, I mentioned that the 6 of spades is a good card because it blocks 8-6. more I'm thinking about this, maybe it's not actually a good card. Because when you have a 6 in your hand, you block Ace-6 and King-6 and 10-6 suited and 9-6 suited. These are hands that would very likely go for a bluff. However, you do block the spade, so I suppose it is a better card than a non-spade. It looks like Boika does eventually make the call. He's going to lose, and Adrián Mateos ships the tournament. All in all, I think it's a pretty interesting hand. I think Mateos played his hand perfectly. I think Boika definitely could have gone for very different lines in this hand. If I was in his shoes, what would I have done? I would have called pre-flop, check called flop, check called turn, check fold river, and probably move on with my life. That said, you will find the players who make deep runs in tournaments more often than not find the aggressive lines, because sometimes that results in you getting all the chips. That's me for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, do me a quick favor, click the like and subscribe button below. Also, there's the notification bell down there. Make sure you click that. I know only 9.36% of you have clicked that button. Let's bump that number up to 10.10% today. Have a great day. Thank you very much for watching. Good luck in your games, and I'll talk to you next time.